Hello students, we will be talking about the various theories of biogenesis and abiogenesis. Now what is the meaning of this? There were many people who believed that life came from non-living creatures. Now this is called as abiogenesis or spontaneous generation. They believe that life came spontaneously, like from wet soil the frogs sprouted out, from meat the maggots just came out, from curd or from ice cream flies are sprouting out. So these are all non-living things from which the organisms simply sprouted, living creatures sprouted out. So that is called as spontaneous generation or theory of abiogenesis, and this was strongly supported by Aristotle and John Needham. There were people who disproved the theory of spontaneous generation, and they said that life came from living creatures, and they said that it's biogenesis theory, that is life came from pre-existing life cannot come from from non-living creatures. So that is called as biogenesis, theory of biogenesis, and this was theory of spontaneous generation was greatly opposed by Francisco de Redi Spallanzani and Louis Pasteur, for which they conducted various experiments to prove the theory of biogenesis or to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation. Let us see what are the various experiments. The first experiment or the first observation made was by Aristotle, who told that he just had observations, he did not do any experiment, wherein he observed that the turtles or the frogs are coming out from the wet mud, or he saw that the flies are sprouting out from meat, or the flies are sprouting out from ice cream. So this is what, and he said that see, these are all non-living things from which the living creatures are sprouting out. But many people were opposing it, so they wanted to prove that this is wrong. So the first one was Francisco de Redi. He was an Italian physician. He did an experiment to prove that spontaneous generation does not exist. So what he did was he took a beaker, and in the beaker he took meat, and he left it aside for many days. He saw that there were maggots that came out from the meat. So he said that the maggots from the meat is because meat has not given rise to the maggots, but probably over the days when it was left open, the flies might have come from outside. They have come to feed on the meat. They would have laid their eggs, and those eggs would have given rise to the maggots. So next what he did was he took a beaker and he placed one piece of the meat, and that beaker he covered it, he made it airtight with a cork. He kept it aside for many days. Now to this he saw that the meat did not give rise to the maggots. He said that see, the flies did not, now I did not allow the flies to come inside, since the movement of flies were blocked because of the cork, and hence the flies did not get an opportunity to sit on the meat, and they did not lay eggs, and that's how the meat did not give rise to the maggots. So meat is not giving rise to the maggots, it's the flies. So people started questioning him and telling him that you have made the flask airtight. The vital requirement, that is air, is blocked here. Now because there is no air, the organisms, the living creatures are not able to grow, and that's the reason they have not grown. So what he did was he took a beaker and he placed one piece of the meat and he covered it with muslin cloth, kept it aside for many days, wherein there was easy access for the air to get inside through the muslin cloth, but the flies could not penetrate inside, they could not get inside, as the muslin cloth would block it. Kept it aside, he found that again on the meat there were no maggots growing. So he said the maggots did not grow because the flies could not get an opportunity to come inside and sit on the meat and lay the eggs. So thus he said that meat is not giving rise to the maggots, but the flies have kept the laid their eggs, and that's giving rise to the flies are giving rise to the maggots and not the meat. But when he kept this same flask for many more days, he observed that the maggot slowly started coming out of the meat. Now this was one disadvantage. Now this was a drawback of his experiment. Actually, why the maggots came, people started telling, see, the meat has ultimately given rise to the maggots. But actually what was the reason here is that the meat which was kept was not sterile. Of course, the meat had pre-existing microorganisms. That is the reason the microorganisms started growing on them, and thus the maggots started coming. So the meat was spoiled. So this was the major drawback of his experiment. So John Needham continued to prove his theory of spontaneous generation. So what he did was, he took a beaker, and that beaker he took broth from animal source and plant source both. And because in the previous experiment he said the meat probably was not sterile, and that's the reason the microorganisms spoiled the meat. So what he did was, he took the broth, and that broth he heated it for several hours. He took the broth and he heated it, assuming that heating of the broth will kill the microorganisms, and the mouth of the flask was kept open. Yes, the broth was initially, it was turbid because of the presence of microorganism. As he gradually heated the flask, the broth started becoming clear, which means the organisms were getting killed. So broth was clear, and then once the broth came down to room temperature, he covered the flask with a muslin cloth. After he covered it with muslin cloth, he kept it aside for a very long time. Now many days aside. Again, for his support, he saw that the broth became turbid, which proved that broth gave rise to microorganisms. He said that the organisms, pre-existing microorganisms, if present on the broth, I have killed it by heating, but still the microorganisms, even after killing microorganisms, the broth gave rise to microorganisms, and hence broth became turbid. Now the drawbacks of this was that the heating was not sufficient to kill all the microorganisms, and thus the broth became turbid. The second drawback was that the organisms, the beaker was kept open, so the air could gain entry, and along with the air, the microorganisms also gain entry into the broth, and thus from there the microorganisms gain entry and the broth became turbid. Now the same experiment was modified by Lazarus Palzani, and Spallanzani stood up for theory of biogenesis. He said that spontaneously, definitely the organisms cannot, or it cannot come out. So what he did was, he took a round bottom flask and he took broth, and he boiled the broth for a very long time, kept the flask open, brought down to room temperature, and he saw that after many days the broth became turbid, which says yes, the organisms might have come from the broth. He said that from the air the microorganisms have gained entry. So he continued his experiment, telling that he took again a round bottom flask, he heated it, he boiled it for a long time. After boiling, he covered the flask, he made it airtight with a cork. He did not allow the flask to cool down, but when it was hot, he covered it with rubber cork, and then he kept it aside for many days. He did not find the growth of microorganisms. The broth remained clear. Hence he said that in the previous one the broth became turbid, not because the broth has given rise to the microorganisms, but from the environment microorganisms have gained entry into the broth. But this broth did not become turbid because obviously microorganisms are not there, broth has not given rise to the microorganisms, and there was no access of the microorganisms from the environment to gain entry because I have covered it. So this was his experiment to prove biogenesis or to disprove theory of spontaneous generation. But the drawback to this was, people pointed out, was that they said again, you are closing, or you are not allowing the vital requirement, that is the air. You have closed the conical flask and you're not allowing the air to enter inside, and that's the reason the broth is not able to give rise to the living creature, that is the microorganism. Now for this, uh, experiment was conducted by Louis Pasteur, and that experiment is called as a swan-necked experiment. Now what did he do is that he took a flask, a round bottom flask with a long neck, and he added broth into that, and that neck, he heated the neck part, and when you heat the neck took up a shape, and this is the shape, a U shape, a swan necked shape the flask took up. And then he heated the broth for a very long time. After the broth was heated for a very long time, he cooled it. Now, he wanted to say that I am allowing the vital requirement, that is air, to gain entry, but I am not allowing the microorganisms to gain entry from the outside. So, because the flask was swan-necked, what happened was that air was easily able to enter inside, but the microorganisms, because they would just be moved by the air current, they would try to gain entry, they would get stuck here, or even if they try to gain entry, they would get stuck at this curve of the swan-necked flask. So they did not have the access of entering into the broth. After the broth was boiled for a very long time, the broth was kept aside. The dust or the microorganisms would get trapped here at this junction, but the air would easily go inside. Now here, kept it aside. For his surprise, the experiment, for the first time, the broth became turbid. Later, he understood that there were some cracks at this point, and that's the reason the organisms from there had gained entry. So again, he repeated the experiment, made sure that the glassware is firm, and continued the experiment, boiled the broth, and then kept it aside for a very long time, many days. He found that the broth remained clear. There were no organisms growing in the broth, and thus he proved the theory of biogenesis. He said that it is not the broth which is giving rise to the microorganisms, but the organisms from the air is gaining entry into the thing. And secondly, he said that I have not blocked the vital requirement, that is air. Air can gain entry, but still the broth is remaining sterile. So the organisms, but still the organisms are not growing, and hence he disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. Thank you, students.